I am extremely happy to welcome two fantastic speakers for this panel today on kickstarting a new engine for transatlantic relations. So it is very clear that Europe's driving energy for much of the past decades has been its relationship with the Americas, not just, of course, the United States, but also in Canada, many of the other American states. And this has not ebbed or flowed in the decades since. Nevertheless, a new type of relationship is emerging, especially after the shock of the Trump administration and after the resurgent ideas of European strategic autonomy and concepts that have stemmed for years now in European debates. The war in Ukraine has only furthered this trend towards a new relationship with the US, its partners, and North America. And we're here to discuss a little bit about what that might look like. Now, these two fantastic speakers today have actually both come from North America just in the past days. In fact, thank you very much, Dr. Pell, for coming today, essentially from the airport. It's a privilege to have you here. I'll just quickly with the introductions and then leave to Dr. Bell and then to Fletcher. So Dr. Bell is currently a distinguished fellow at the Centre for Security and Defence Studies here at the Brussels School of Governance. This comes after decades of work in security and defence fields, working both as advisor to the Obama administration, as Assistant Secretary General at NATO, and over 18 years of work in Capitol Hill in security and defence issues. He also has a PhD from the Fletcher School of Diplomacy and is a well-renowned researcher and commentator on these affairs. And Fletcher is head of the United States and Canada division at the European External Action Service, coming after herself a long career in diplomacy, working both with Helga Schmidt, the former Secretary General of the EAS, working in the EU delegation in Chile, and I believe in the EU delegation to Lebanon. There we are. So we have two absolutely fantastic speakers today, and I cannot wait to begin to hear their opening remarks. And then this will be another hour session with the Q&As and much time to ask questions. So Dr. Bell, please.
Well, thank you very much, Philippe. And I very much appreciate your emphasis you put in your intro on Canada. I felt, well, my father during World War II flew for the Royal Canadian Air Force. So I've always felt I was sort of a lonely American out at NATO, trying to remind people that when you talk about America, you know, there's this country called Canada. Thank you for that. Let me begin with an apology. I'm a little disheveled. I've come from about a 24-hour trip, involved one train and 3 flights getting here from New Mexico, which is not easy, from Santa Fe. I was at a conference that was hosted by the nuclear laboratory there, where you had the first atomic bomb created in Los Alamos, and the Strategic Command, 3 days talking about what we in Europe will do if Putin uses a nuke in Ukraine. So it was a fascinating conference, but it did mean that I got here just in time for yours. So I'm not really dressed for this, except maybe student clothes. And to make it worse, I lost my reading glasses on the airplane. So I'm not quite sure what I intended to say. I'm going to do my very best to read my notes without reading glasses. I was fascinated, Philippe, by the title. I've been working on this title, I think, ever since I got this invitation, because it talks about kickstarting, which is a great word in English. I have no idea. En français, qu'est-ce que c'est le mot pour kickstart? Does anyone know? Or in Flemish or Dutch, German? Does everyone just say kickstart and adopt the English? Anyway, we sort of know kickstarting. Kickstarting means you really try to come out of the starting blocks, like in a race at the Olympics, with a kick from the very beginning. And it occurred to me, as you mentioned in your intro, that Trump was not trying to kickstart a new engine for transatlantic relations. Trump was kicking the engine, the traditional engine for transatlantic relations, because what I would say the old engine was our shared values, our shared traditions, our shared histories, our mutual respect for human rights, the rule of law, rules-based order globally. That's been the traditional enduring engine for transatlantic relations. And that's what Trump intentionally kicked. Okay. He said the EU was a foe. He said NATO was obsolete. He put tariffs on our trade, questioned Germany's commitment to mutual defense, tried to pull troops out. I mean, this was kicking and even questioning sort of the underlying assumption that we are in this together as democracies on both sides of the Atlantic. Then you had, fortunately, President Biden's election, and I would argue that Biden, from day one, dedicated himself to kickstarting the transatlantic relationship as we had known it, the old engine, with the emphasis on values. Now, it's not to say that there's not elements of competition. I'm sure Ruth deals with this all the time. And in many respects, Biden is quite protectionist on a number of issues, sort of reflecting I don't want to say America first, but build it in America, sort of jobs, the economy, democratic base, and the manufacturing blue states in America. So it left me scratching my head, wondering what your organization is looking for in terms of kickstarting a new engine. But what I would argue, just as you argued, is that question's already been answered and solved, because this is exactly what Putin has done. It's not the new engine for transatlantic relations that anyone wanted, and it's at the cost of catastrophe and devastation and sacrifice for the very brave people in Ukraine. But Putin has kickstarted with his invasion on February 24th, a new engine for transatlantic relations. And that new engine is the reality, the wake-up call. HRVP Burrell called it a geopolitical reawakening. Chancellor Scholz called it the Zeitenwende. Everything has changed. Whereas the NATO strategic concept says, we cannot rule out the possibility of Russian aggression against a NATO member state. We thought we were past that in the post-Cold War era, and even with the first 7-8 years after the annexation illegally of Crimea and the Russian hybrid intervention in eastern Ukraine with the two provinces, we still, I think, thought that there was some taboo about interstate war and naked, brutal, blatant aggression. And we now know that that's wrong. So Putin has kickstarted a new engine for transatlantic relations. And the consequence of that has been that the transatlantic relationship has never been closer. At least, I don't want to say in my lifetime, because that takes you back to 1947. And I'm sure during the Marshall Plan in the 50s, when we were establishing all these institutions to have a rules-based order in the world, we were very close. But let's just say, for a long, long time, we've never been this close. And that's not just my opinion. What strikes me is that we're sitting here in October 2022, and we now have three sort of strategic documents that are foundational and fundamental. And I'm talking about the NATO strategic concept, the EU strategic compass, and just released 2 days ago, President Biden's first national security strategy. All three of them take account of the reality of Russia's aggression. All three of them try to define a horizon of, let's say, a decade or more. The NATO strategic concept was approved by 30 heads of state. The strategic compass was approved in the council and then endorsed by heads of state of the 27 member states. Now, of course, there's an overlap there, but what my point is just, this is not some think tank tank piece, as important as think tank pieces are, or what some professor has written in Foreign Affairs magazine. This is the West, the transatlantic West, coming together and saying, this we believe, and endorsing a set of principles at the highest level. So it's not just words. Words matter when they're endorsed at that level. And in the case of Biden's national security strategy, something that they have worked very hard on the last 7 or 8 months to get it right, taking into account this reality. I just want to read a couple of excerpts from these 3 documents that go to this, the heart of this question about what's the state of the transatlantic relation. And this is where it's going to challenge me to read it. But the strategic concept says, in part, the transatlantic bond between our nations is indispensable to our security. We are bound together by common values, individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We remain firmly committed to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the UN and the North Atlantic Treaty. NATO is the unique, essential, and indispensable transatlantic forum to consult, coordinate, and act on all matters related to our individual and collective security. The strategic compass says, the EU will help to strengthen NATO and become a stronger transatlantic partner, a partner that is more capable of sharing the burden of maintaining international peace and security. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has shown both how essential NATO is for the collective defense of its members and the important role that the EU plays in today's complex security and defense environment. And the National Security Strategy, just released this week, reads, with a relationship rooted in shared democratic values, common interests, and historic ties, the transatlantic relationship is a vital platform on which many other elements of our foreign policy are built. Europe has been and will continue to be our foundational partner. This is the President of the United States saying, Europe has been and will continue to be our foundational partner in addressing the full range of global challenges to effectively pursue a common global agenda. We are broadening and deepening, sounds like EU language, broadening and deepening the transatlantic bond, strengthening NATO, raising the level of ambition in the US-EU relationship, and standing by our European allies and partners in defense of the rules-based system that underpins our security, prosperity, and values. So, very strong words about our interdependent, indispensable relationship across the Atlantic Ocean in addressing these challenges. And it's not just heads of state. If you read the 2022 German Marshall Fund Transatlantic Trends polling that just came out about 2 weeks ago, this was polling done this summer, you find some pretty extraordinary stuff. It says there is massive support for US involvement in European security and defense. But that was not Trump's position. Don't take that for granted. You have people running for the United States Senate with elections less than 4 weeks away who are saying we shouldn't worry about Ukraine's border. We should be worrying about America's border with Mexico. But this is good. And some of the key findings are that the EU and NATO are seen as important by large majorities for the security of respondents' countries. So I would argue that in terms of public attitudes and governmental decision-making on these foundational documents, we're at a peak. I'll close with just one question. How long can it last? Is this like the guy falling off the office building as he goes by the 40th floor? It still seems to be okay. Well, I would say there are three main variables that relate to this question of how long this incredibly close transatlantic bonded relationship can last. The first, most obviously, is how the war in Ukraine ends itself. There could be a Ukrainian victory. I was in a Zoom conference yesterday with a former three-star general of the US Army in Europe, General Ben Hodges. He is quite certain, and he has a little experience with the Army, that Ukraine is going to recapture the Donbass by Christmas and Crimea by summer. Now, I think he's a bit of an outlier in that optimism, but it could happen. There could be a complete implosion of the Ukrainian military and chaos in Moscow, and somewhere out of some mix, someone who decides that when you're in a hole, you need to stop digging and tries to get Russia back into the world, in which case we could find ourselves going back to some of the tensions that are based on trade or other issues that sometimes have divided us. Or you could have a Russian victory, which I think would really escalate the concerns about a broader war, broader aggression. Or you could have some extended stalemate that begins not just this winter, but going forward, that tests some of the elements of our unity right now. So very hard to predict. The second variable, of course, is who is the American president in January 2025? Are we back with Mr. Trump kicking the transatlantic engine? I certainly hope not. I personally don't think so. But I can't sit here and say I'm extremely confident that the president in 2025 is going to be a Democrat. And then last, just as a wild card, there's the possibility of war with China. A Taiwan war that escalates, maybe even nuclear. This conference I was at the last 3 days, on the last day, went through a whole role play scenario where we were engaged in a 2-region war, both of which had gone nuclear. And I can't think of few foreign policy issues that would divide the United States and Europe more than war in Asia. That's never been one that's brought us together, if you look back at Korea or Vietnam. So let's hope that's not the case. So I think for now, Putin has kickstarted this new engine. There'll be another phase some point. There could be other kickstarts that could bring us together in some future era. Climate change, I would hope, would kickstart a closer relationship. I would hope if there was a new and more deadly pandemic, that would bring us together. Or there could be a meteor coming towards the Earth, for those of you that saw the movie Don't Look Up, that could bring us together to save the Earth. But those are a little fantastic, and for now, I'll just deal with the wolf that's at the door and not the meteor that we haven't gotten on our radar yet. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for your intervention. And now,
well, good morning. It's very difficult to come in after this presentation by the professor. But what I can say is that I've been on a number of panels since the start of the war in Ukraine. And all the time I have always started my speeches by saying I couldn't agree more with the previous speaker. I will not, I'll try to focus more on, I'll stay out of the security angle because I think the professor covered it well. But certainly for the European Union, this, the relationship with the United States and Canada, but certainly with the United States, this is the biggest relationship that we have. It's the biggest, the most important relationship that we have. And we certainly, and what this war has made us all realize is that we have friends around the world, but we have very, very few real friends. And when it comes to, effectively getting people to join us when selling our narrative, selling our position, and having people actually come in and really put in that vote, it is costing. It's costing us. It is costing us a lot of lobbying, a lot of explanation, a lot of So I think the relationship has been kickstarted. It was kicked by President Trump, kickstarted by President Biden. Certainly got a real shock when in February. I think now, going forward, we really have to work together to make this relationship work for ourselves, for our economies, for our people, but also possibly of how the world should look or should be working together. I think on the importance of the relationship, I think a lot has been said. If you go on Digitrade, Digitrade's website, they explain this as a €1 trillion relationship. And that's almost half of the global GDP. So we really matter when it comes to putting, when we come to the table. How much will we matter when it comes to speaking to China? Let us see. Let us see first how we will work together, how we define our industrial policies, what our vision, and whether we will end up competing each other or working together through the creation of the Trade and Technology Council, for instance. So going forward, where do we also take this relationship? So that's one area. I think the foundations of what the relationship could give have been set now by both by President Biden and President von der Leyen from our side. We have worked, when it comes to sorting out trade disputes, when it comes to discussing the future of technology, when it comes to discussing major foreign policy issues, we have dialogues. We have so now, what do we make out of this, and how do we take it forward? And is this possibly a way how the United States and the EU could work together in the future? So that's one area. I think the second area on how how this relationship will go forward is also a bit the responsibility that we Europeans have in this relationship, because we're it's very easy to point and say President Trump was hurt us, and he set a new narrative in the United States. Then President Biden comes. He's very he's very European. He claims to be Irish as well, but he still comes with his Inflation Reduction Act. He still pulls out of Afghanistan and does not really discuss with us. Well, when he needed, he did AUKUS. So we can also, there's also that narrative, but we also have to take the share of the burden of the responsibility to make this relationship work as Europeans. And one, that's European unity, and really be united when, in particular, when it comes facing Russia, when it comes facing the war in Ukraine, but also when it comes to next week, there'll be a discussion at the FAC on Europe's vision on China, and also at the European Council after that. So I don't think that, and as the professor said, China will be probably one of the big issues in a number of years down the line. So I don't think there will be a big change or shift of where we, how Europe and the EU deals with China at the moment. But certainly a reflection, we're having those reflections and they're needed. So let's see where that builds up towards the end. But ultimately, certainly, as the professor said, Putin has, gave a kick to this relationship. Now, the United States is again engaged in Europe, is is deeply engaged in Europe through NATO, through having troops on the ground, to having said that Article 5 works. But I just come back from the United States, and what do you hear on the Hill? what is Europe doing for Ukraine? And when are your billions coming? We've put many billions coming. And I think, again, as Europeans, where this war is touching us to the core, we fail to come up with a narrative and a good narrative to sell and to say what we are doing for Ukraine. So we fail to say that we also put 22 billion euros on the table. We fail to say that we have 500,000 kids, Ukrainian kids in schools that were absorbed in 6 months. We fail to say that, Europe was not a security actor. Nobody would have envisaged that Europeans would put in money to support countries to buy arms, but we have put 2.5 billion euros, and probably more will come up on Monday. It's our shared responsibility to tell the story and to say how much we're doing. The total cost, 8.1 million people left Ukraine. They were at one point in Europe, 4 million registered, 1 million already working. I mean, if one of the smallest countries and European country, EU countries that is furthest away from Ukraine, Ireland, today has 48,000 Ukrainians that went into Ireland. That's 1% of the Irish population. If you translate it to American numbers, that's 3 million people showing up on US soil. So if we don't tell this, if we don't share the stories, it is true that on the Hill people start saying, why do I focus on Ukraine when I have the problems when I have problems on the border? I just come back from my trip was a bit less security focused. I went to Ottawa, Washington, and Miami. And if you go to, I will spend 2 days in Miami, probably one of the states where there are candidates for future presidents to the United States. They don't speak of Ukraine. They don't speak. That's not their reality. So if we really want this transatlantic relationship to work, I mean, we as Europeans and as institutions and as member states, we also need to do our side of the story to make it work. We cannot always, point at it's Trump, it's this, it's that. So I think, and it's the work that we have to do collectively. I think institutionally, as the professor said, we work very well. I think certainly the President Biden is surrounded by a superb team that also puts the United States first but has also really engaged with allies and partners. We as Europeans collectively, the institutions, member states, EU, everyone has to rise to this occasion because our continent and the European Union needs it today. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Before we go to the question and answer, I do want to push on a couple of particular points there. One is on China and sort of institutions that are trying to coordinate EU-US relations to it. So we've mentioned about the TTC, the Trade Technology Council. Is the TTC a good enough forum to coordinate these large, globally important relationships between the EU, US, and China? Or are there better ways that we can actually coordinate and harmonize the role, essentially, of the two actors globally? Yeah, that was one question I want to throw out there. Do you believe the TTC is going to work, fundamentally? I don't know. Do you want to go first on that?
It's a start. It's obviously not sufficient. The fact that NATO in this strategic concept for the first time institutionally has had to work through the challenge of getting a consensus position on how to define China, adversary, competitor, rival, is a start. But these are early days, and we sort of put ourselves in a ditch with the, as Biden later said, the clumsiness of the AUKUS rollout and the way that was handled with no consultation to France, put us behind the 8 ball, as we would say in America, in the United States, part of America, that we're having to still recover from. So I think there are institutional questions about how you address the military dimension of the Chinese threat. It can be addressed in NATO EU fora, and that's that partnership. As I read, there's commitment to try to intensify the relationship. You could try to imagine some evolution of AUKUS that became more than just a consultation forum, or build a nuclear submarine for Australia forum that took into account France's 9,000 military personnel in the Pacific, or the UK's interest in perhaps stationing their second carrier in the Pacific. And then there's the whole question of the Quad and whether that's exclusionary, or there are ways to tie the EU or individual European nations into the Quad in the Pacific. But I think there are more questions than answers, but at least we've taken the first baby steps, I think, towards trying to institutionalize it. One key building block is the TTC, but it's not sufficient in and of itself.
I would say that, I certainly agree very much with what the professor said. On the TTC more specifically, I just want to say an anecdote. The TTC was actually offered to the Trump administration. Like the EU-US-China dialogue was offered to the Trump administration from our side, and it was seen as a way to let's see if we can do something beyond, if we couldn't negotiate with Lighthizer at the time, so we needed to find ways of engaging the US, because it is the most important partnership that the EU has, no matter who is in the White House. That never took off. Biden administration comes in, and the first thing that they said, we don't want nothing to do with the TTC. We don't want anything to do with the China dialogue. We would come up with something else. 3 months down the line, of course, we want the Trade and Technology Council, and of course, we want to have a China dialogue. So we started off, we have a summit, and we agreed to have the Trade and Technology Council and the China summit. On the TTC itself, you need to remember that the TTC, started off when, at the time, we had still a lot of trade disputes ongoing with the US, or they were being solved around the first months of the administration. So that's, the Trade and Technology Council was seen from our side as a way to ensure also that, for example, with Canada, we have an established trade agreement, CETA. Which means that means more than any beyond, the value of trade agreements, it means that you have technical discussions, ministerial meetings, a lot of meetings all the time. And that means that a problem never becomes a huge issue. So you have even if it's not solved, by the time, as time passes, it becomes mitigated because you've had so many discussions. With the United States, we don't have that. So I think that Trade and Technology Council was conceived as an idea of, let's sit together, let's get our systems to know each other, to avoid avoid having 301 investigations coming in out of nowhere, or and having friction. So let's try to find ways, get working groups, get people together. A few months down the line, the invasion of Russia happened, and it was also focused a lot on how, especially from the US side, because I think from the EU side it was more seen in this way, how now that we on our side, we have the DMA and the DSA, how do we get together to discuss the implementation of this? Again, climate change, electric vehicles, how do we work together to make sure that we can work together also to mitigate climate within the trade and technology focus. So this was the idea from our side. From the US side, there was always the idea that this was to be used to respond to the China challenge. So there again, we don't always see the TTC from the same view, but few months down the line, the invasion happens, and when we came to roll out export controls, the fact that we had people sitting together already for many weeks, already knowing each other, there were people knew which phones to pick up, it took 2 months. And the invasion happened a few days later, unprecedented. This, it would have never happened. If you see what, how we did the sanctions on Crimea, totally different. And so so this is now what the TTC is what the TTC role is happening. Again, we have now the Inflation Reduction Act. We're not, as Europeans, we're not very comfortable with parts of it. Whilst we like very much that President Biden is engaged on climate. So can we use the TTC to, whilst we understand that these relationships will be always competitive. We have our CBAM, the US will have the Inflation Reduction Act. We have our GDPR, the US doesn't like it, but can we sit together and can we find ways how we don't harm each other's markets, how we can actually find ways where the two ecosystems work without necessarily competing. Because if we start competing with each other or killing our own industries, the only ones that, and this is clear for both sides, the only ones that are going to be very happy are the Chinese. That's for sure. So this is, I think, where, and this is now, if the TTC can do this, can, offer the forum where, the Inflation Reduction Act and other legislative proposals, decisions can be discussed, and I think it can go forward. But certainly it cannot. It's not the only forum to solve all issues.
Thank you very much. We'll open the floor now to any questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Just raise your hands if so. Maybe there's quite a few. I'll take 3, and then we'll go from there. So we'll take these 3. So. Peter, go first.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a very practical question. We talk about a lot of institutions, but at the very end, it's people who matters. And I think we did not invest enough in investing in new elites, in recruiting, in shaping their minds on the transatlantic relations. In the US, the attention has shifted to the Pacific, for example. The old elites they died out. We had this strong European background. I think this is a field which we should really focus on, because it's not institutions at the very end. It's, as you mentioned, it's people interacting. It's an issue of trust, for example. It should be never underestimated in these relations.
Thank you. So about recruiting people in the next generation, is there a question there? Yep. Okay. Yeah, we'll take a few questions, and then I'll leave you to answer.
Yeah, so my question is just if, because I think you mentioned one of the wild cards is if there's something happening with China, for example, conflict. In that case, what do you think would be the US's expectation towards the EU and Europe? Yeah, that's it.
And then lastly, Lisa.
Thank you very much for your contribution. So you mentioned that you stayed 2 days in Miami, and I stayed the last 2 years there. So it's, it's interesting to see how things are developing, and they were the past 2 years, even during the pandemic. And you mentioned also climate change. And as, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, might be one of the winning person in 2024. So I wanted to know maybe more about your point of view, both of you, about what would happen if we have Ron DeSantis being the next US president, even though it's too soon to tell, but and what do we mean for transatlantic relations? Thank you.
Very much. Maybe I'll start with Ruth. I don't know on the 3 questions.
Quickly on the first one, I think there's a lot to be done. And I think from the European side, EU side, and member states, we need to work more collectively on people to people. We need to get more students to Europe. We need to make sure that the interests in Europe is maintained. And I think we're doing a bigger effort in the institutions. Certainly from our side, we meet all CODELs that come from the Senate. We're starting people-to-people programs. We try to meet as many universities as possible. But I think in Europe, we have a problem of narrative. We don't, as the professor said, I'm always, I think President Biden and President von der Leyen are spending too much time together because, we speak in a language that's beyond the 1 square kilometer of Schumann is not understood. So a lot of work to be done there. We're certainly trying, working with staffers, from the lower rank to the chiefs of staff, but never enough. So I think that there has to be a collective effort also from the member states that all have a special relationship with the United States. I think if we don't work it that way, certainly the look towards towards Asia will remain. Maybe Putin has helped to recreate the interest as well in Europe. So a lot of work. I think on China and expectation, I'll let the professor work on this, but certainly, our relationship with China as EU is, we are much more intertwined with China than the United States. So, still the United States still is very much linked to China. So a war on Taiwan would be, or a war with China is huge. It will be highly consequential. Miami. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball on who will be in the White House in 2024. What I can say from what I take away from my visit to Miami, we did not meet the governor. Of course, he was very busy with the response to the hurricane. Also, the president had just been there, and he was with the governor responding to the hurricane. But what I take from Miami is the vision, at least of the people that work around the governor, etc., is to. We were told that for Miami will grow. We will build higher. We will expand. We will invest. And when we said, but climate change, Miami might be, and parts of Miami might be underwater in a number of years. We have green companies at the port, and that was the response literally. So Ron DeSantis himself, we were told that he has been twice out of Florida, or at least out of the United States. Once because he was invited to Israel, which is very important for us as for the US, one of our key partners. And then when he was in Fallujah in Iraq. So I think there will be, if he reaches the White House, there will be a lot of work from our side that needs to be done to make sure that this relationship gets where it is. Then again, being a governor and running a campaign is one thing. Actually, being the leader of the United States and the world is another thing. So let's see where that holds. But certainly, Florida, I think today is consolidating into a red state. Himself, the governor, and Rubio have 6 to 8 percentage points ahead. And the GOP narrative is very much installed. Also a hard line when it comes to, education, LGBTI rights, migration, etc. We will see. But certainly also this is a reality of what the United States, and that's why when I said that we as Europeans cannot only be expecting the United States to be active in Europe, because the reality in the United States is, governors need to be elected and senators need to be elected within their realities of what the reality is shaping there. So if we don't manage to have, attract the Americans towards Europe and the reason why we should be together, then it will become more and more difficult. As the narrative you'll see in the elections, it's about inflation, it's about crime, it's, foreign policy is very much down the line. So that's the reality I think in Miami and many other places in the US.
Thank you.
Yeah, Peter, so there's a lot there. I agree completely with Peter in his question that people matter and that we need to press the envelope to expand programs that bring, recruit younger people as transatlanticists. I come from, as you mentioned, Philippe, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in Boston, which is fantastically international, and so many brilliant young European graduate students that I was with in the last couple of years as I was finishing my PhD. So seen from there, it looked a little better, but of course, COVID, I think, has played a role here. Academics by Zoom doesn't exactly bring us together, and it also really cut down on the number of Americans who just came to Europe to see Europe. So it tended to divide us. But there is a role for institutions here. The NATO Public Diplomacy Program works very hard to try to educate people about what NATO is other than just tanks and airplanes. But that's common funded. A lot of nations now with the energy crisis and significant increases in their national defense budgets are not exactly thinking this is a good time to vote for increased common funding in NATO. So they're going to struggle to go very far with these programs. Maybe the best hope is the EU Erasmus funding. I'm a professor of the practice at Georgia Tech, and the EU is at Georgia Tech. When we have a Jean Monnet Center of Academic Excellence there, and when I walk into my office in Atlanta on campus, I walk past an EU flag. We're doing our bit. War with China. I think the assumption has been that there's some timeline here in terms of President Xi and what he has said, and sort of when the pressure really is on him based on his own statements, that most people have thought 2027 is where the Taiwan question comes to a head. The issue now is simply whether China would see it in an opportunist way, particularly if the war in Ukraine spills beyond the borders of Ukraine, or if there's nuclear weapons use in Ukraine that then engages the United States and NATO allies in direct kinetic warfare with the Russians in Europe. Would the Chinese say, maybe this is our moment to just take that? I would point out, because your question was, what would the United States be asking of the EU? If there's a war over Taiwan, and I certainly hope that deterrence holds and that there's not a war, it's not going to be a lot of boots on the ground. It's not like the war in Ukraine. It's a small island, and the Chinese have to get across the Taiwan Strait. So they have to put together sort of like a D-Day invasion force with amphibious ships. The United States is going to be trying to blow up those ships with long-range precision strike missiles, and the Chinese are going to be trying to sink the American fleet. That's going to be the principal dynamic if there's a war over Taiwan, at least in terms of the pre-invasion phase. And my assumption is it takes a long time to get ships to the Pacific. It would be sort of a come as you are war. And what the United States mainly would be asking of Europe is understand that our priority, talk about a pivot to Asia. If we're engaged in major conventional warfighting with China, and I certainly hope that's not the case, Europe's going to have to fill some gaps in terms of defense and security in Europe, and maybe even sort of prosecution of whatever phase the Ukraine war is in at that point. When I was defense advisor at NATO, we went through one of the regular 4-year cycles of the NATO defense planning process. And the first thing you do is fill out a questionnaire about what you have in your military kit, what carrier groups you have and fighter planes and missile defense batteries, and which of those NATO can assume will be available for a European contingency. And we decided for the first time in 7 decades to be honest and actually fill out the questionnaire and warn NATO that if we were engaged in a war in the Pacific, a whole bunch of stuff you thought you were going to get, you're not going to get. The idea was to provide an incentive for Europe to do more, and Europe is doing more, but because of the war in Ukraine. And if you go back to the 2% pledge in 2014 at Wales, there's been a steady trend, and my compliments to Europe for that, but you would have to really do more. But when we did this in the defense planning process, the military authorities said, well, either Europe has to fill those possible gaps, or you have to assume a lot more risk. And our European allies basically said, well, we'll assume the risk, that there won't be 2 wars at the same time. But let's hope that's not the case. Last, Miami. I lived in Miami for 2 years, so I'm very fond of Miami. Now I live on Amelia Island, which is about 500 miles north of Miami, but still in Florida. And there, Ruth, in our symphony in Jacksonville, we start each performance singing the Ukrainian national anthem. And there's a fantastic number of Ukrainian flags out in people's front yards. So I like Miami, but come north and see where we're really supporting Ukraine. Miami, of course, is a multicultural city, unparalleled. The Haitian, Dominican Republic, Cuban, Venezuelan, exile communities, it's very rich down there. But it tends to be oriented, let's just say, to the south. Okay, its priority is the hemisphere, because so many of its people have come from the Western Hemisphere. So I think you get a little different view maybe in Miami about the war in Ukraine than you might get in other major American cities, including some in Florida. As for DeSantis, I don't agree with so many of his positions. So I'm not a fan of my governor in Florida, but I would just say, I think he sort of plays the role of a Trump populist, but there's a different person there. I mean, he has a degree from Yale and a law degree from Harvard, and he was in the Navy, and he deployed with Navy SEAL Team 6 to Iraq. So he's been to our top institutions and has been with our most elite military forces abroad. Florida is the #1 state in America for foreign direct investment. It really views itself as having a global orientation, particularly in our hemisphere. Environmental issues for DeSantis has got to be a priority because of the Everglades, even if he doesn't want to come right out and say climate change is man-made. So I would just say, I hope that if we should have President DeSantis in 2025, that there, although it would be a very conservative set of domestic policies, that he would be much more inclined to work with Europe and maintain the commitments to NATO than you might fear. But I can't guarantee it.
We're running a bit low on time, but I did want to give, especially the online question, a chance. Maybe one of others on here a bit quicker. I'll just quickly grab the online question.
Definitely. It is on the economic aspect, which you have addressed a little bit already. This one mentions the European Union particularly, so perhaps more to Ruth, but I'm sure both of you can answer. It has to do with Europe or European Union positioning itself in the sort of US-China economic rivalry or the race that takes place there, while the European Union is still an important trade partner to China, and how all of this as a whole influences the economic performance of the European continent, and how the relations with the US sort of from there on. Yeah. How do you navigate that field economically?
Okay.
Yeah.
I would take two final questions. I saw, so.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead. No,
well,
you.
Well, if it's okay with you, Sandra, I see one over there, so I'll grab
Yeah, go ahead.
Otto and then Matteo. So Otto, please, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the very important presentation. So one sort of term that keeps on sort of appearing is the term special relationship. And so I'm from the United Kingdom, where the term special relationship we believe in our sort of media applies to us between the UK and US. I was curious to think, what do you think the implications of Brexit in the UK have for sort of Britain's role as sort of a position between the EU and the United States in terms of transatlantic cooperation and these sort of partnerships that you're talking about?
Fantastic. And last,
Basically, my question was kind of the same as this one, like how United Kingdom as a separate actor now has to be. Like if it's invisible to include the United Kingdom as a third subject in the transatlantic relations, or if our bonds, like if the common bonds, especially the war with Ukraine and the NATO membership are a sufficient guarantee of like an harmonious development of the transatlantic relations, even if it's not included, for example, the sea or another offer.
oh, fantastic. So China and Britain.
I will start with the UK question. I'm afraid I have to break, I'm sorry to break it to you, but all of our member states, 27 plus, you think that they have a special relationship with the United States, that they are the most special, you know. So if you speak to the Lithuanian Prime Minister or, you know, everybody has a special relationship with the US. And we like that, you know, as in the institutions, and we encourage it, and we want more European investments in Europe, in the US, and more relations, and vice versa. So, so that's my answer on the term of special relationship. So, you know, as we said, the relationships are built on people, and certainly President Biden feels very much European and feels very much that this transatlantic relationship, you know, has to work and is a priority for him. And I think the answer to that is his position and that of his cabinet and the you know, the administration on the Northern Ireland Protocol and the priority that has given. And he has given to this. And I think the messaging was very clear also to Prime Minister Liz Truss when she came into office. And that is why we are currently again back to negotiating. That said, they also message us that, you know, as the European Union, you know, that a solution has to be found to this issue. But beyond the Northern Ireland Protocol, beyond this, we as European Union, we want a strong United States and a strong United Kingdom. Because as I said in the beginning, we have friends around the world, but we don't have many friends. So if already between our very like-minded friends that we, you know, at least our vision of the world of where we want it and how we see things and how we respond to Putin and to Xi, etc. If we cannot get together and if we become weaker and if our economies start dwindling, then who's going to set the record straight? And again, I think certainly, you know, the United States wants the European countries to pay up on their 2%, want us to be ready, and certainly neither ourselves nor the United States are happy to see the economic situation at the moment in the United Kingdom. So I think this should be the basis of that set, and we hope that, you know, beyond after a few years on that we will settle and we can sit together and with the UK and find ways. So we were very happy to see Liz Truss participating in the political European political community. We were happy to see that she offered to host the UK offered to be one of the hosts of next meetings. You know, we already sit with the United Kingdom. Again, sanctions package was predominantly in, you know, we worked very much with the United States, but certainly also with the UK. And we hope that this, you know, eventually can transpire to, you know, to other areas. And on the ground, we already work a lot with the United Kingdom. Western Balkans, for instance, with the Quint format, where US, UK, again, you know, work, you know, we and some of our member states. So, but again, we really need to find a way how to work together because there are not many of us around. So that's one. Second, I think on the economic relationship, look, the Russian invasion to Ukraine sanctions. The reality is that most of these sanctions hit European companies and hit it was already the case with the invasion and annexation of Crimea, and now we're at the next stage with this war. So again, as the professor said, there will, there had to be a war in the Pacific, as he explained it, but it will also again be accompanied by a lot of sanctions, a lot of export controls. Again, European businesses will be at the forefront. So I think we need to shore up our economy, and now, from what's happening in this war, and prepare it for what might come eventually. And whilst we look at climate change, whilst we make green investments, whilst we maintain a technological edge, so it's not an easy time for our leaders, and it takes a lot of vision to steer. At least I can speak for the ship of the European Union and the member states towards something that can sustain this eventually. So again, I said there'll be first discussions on China next week and the week after, but it's a very worrying perspective. See what's happening.
So Philippe, I'll just take the two questions. I won't comment on the economic one, but just special relationship and then UK's sort of military relationship with the EU. I think most American political leaders, and most Americans for that matter, think there is a special relationship with Great Britain. We always say we're the same people divided only by the absence of a common language. But if you just watch sort of the outpouring of emotion and attention across America, all the events following Her Majesty's death last month, you really sort of get this sense of how fascinated America remains with the UK and the monarchy. So I think for us, we're sort of surprised there's an issue. Except, we say we want to make this point about the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Good Friday Agreement and the time and effort that President Clinton and Senator Mitchell and others put into that. We really have a stake in that. And for President Biden, it's really amplified. I mean, not only is he Irish Catholic, but he comes from a Republican family where his mother literally would curse pictures of the Queen. Okay, and then Nancy Pelosi is California Catholic. So you have these two powerful Democratic leaders in America now that have very special emotional attachment to this issue of the protocol that Boris Johnson accepted in the negotiations with the EU. But we tend to sort of see that as, okay, there's that, but setting that aside, of course it's a special relationship. The problem comes from the reverse, and that's that since everything in UK politics now, particularly within the Conservative Party, is absolutely driven by fealty to Brexit, it leads them to magnify the importance in the relationship of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So you had Liz Truss, at least when she was campaigning, not wanting to say there was a special relationship, and even saying effectively, special relationship doesn't mean being America's lapdog. So from the Tory party perspective, the fact that the US was putting importance on this protocol then sort of challenges the foundational importance of the whole Brexit decision by their party and magnifies it. Now, I think that can be worked out, assuming that the Truss government survives another week or two, which I don't. I think this thing is spiraling out of control. Someone said at a conference I was at the other day, the only ones in the world that are retreating faster now than the Russians in Ukraine is the Truss government in London. But setting that aside, there is a big question about how the UK does or does not align itself with CSDP missions. That's to be determined, Would they accept third-party status? Would they be willing to contribute troops if they don't have command positions? Is the EU willing to give the UK command positions in a CSDP mission where the UK is a partner nation? I think everyone has been waiting to see how that comes out, but that will come after the Northern Ireland Protocol thing, I think, gets resolved. Now, the new development, as Ruth said, is the somewhat surprising decision by Liz Truss to go to Macron's European Political Community Conference and take a leadership role. So maybe things settle down and the Northern Ireland thing doesn't blow everything up again on Brexit, that they can work that out. And a really interesting question for me is, would the UK be willing to directly join with forces and weaponry in Chancellor Scholz's interesting initiative, now getting real momentum to establish this European missile defense shield? I think he's got about 12 or 13 countries that have signed up so far, not the UK, but presumably the UK could come into that. But depending on what the command and control arrangements are on it, which I don't quite understand yet.
Thank you very much. I think we have another round of applause for this speech. I think we all agree it was a very fascinating discussion debate. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the speakers. And now we'll have the fun panel.